The early 1990s, Tokyo, Japan. A time of massive change in technological circles, in which video game development was undergoing a rapid transformation. The old world of 2D and the new world of 3D, with developers experimenting with the fusion of the two. The possibilities seemed endless as the technology developed and its capabilities grew. The subjects of video games grew with it. Where old games were limited to pixel art to portray their vision, new games would have a grander scale, which would have unforeseen consequences in Japan and outside it. But that would come in later years. Here, in the early 90s, new experimental games were being released that would influence a generation of young game developers to come. One of those developers was Sato Naoko. She was an art student, attending school at Tokyo Zokei University. Video games had never been a major concern of hers, though she'd played a few in her time. In elementary school, she'd been addicted to a Nintendo home console called the TV Game 15, which had simplistic graphics and played things like Pong. But as she grew up, she drifted away from games. The written word was her calling. She loved manga and reading books. Though she grew up in a home where such things were banned, her mother said reading would make her stupid, which only made Sato want to read more. In elementary school, she wrote a book of her own with her friends, a horror story set in America, where a group of kids go camping and die one after another, like a slasher film. Strange stories fascinated her. She grew up during Japan's occult boom, watching TV shows like the Boys sci-fi series. She spent her childhood investigating the weird and unexplained, parallel worlds and time travel. Reading Daijiro Morohoshi's manga growing up was her first experience with a story creating a sense of wonder in her. She loved it. Yokai Hunter, a story wherein myths become reality and reality become myths, would influence Sato's storytelling for years to come. I Am Legend, The Body Snatchers, the works of Dean Koontz and Stephen King, adaptations of H.P. Lovecraft's mythos. Horror had its grip on Sato from a young age. But horror video games wouldn't become an interest of hers until much later, when she was exposed to Resident Evil. Soon after, another game with horror elements had an even stronger impact on her: Moonlight Syndrome. Moonlight Syndrome was Suda51's last work with Human Entertainment before he left to create Grasshopper Manufacture, and it was a strange and frightening game, a title in the Twilight Syndrome series, which blends daily life visual novel aspects with horror elements like ghosts. But Moonlight Syndrome would take a turn for the dark and focus on psychological horror. It was a work so impactful, Sato would remember it decades later. In her own words, she says the way Moonlight Syndrome destroyed its characters left her speechless and totally trapped by its unique trippiness. It was the first time she'd played a game and gotten a sense that there was an author behind the scenes, the sense of a story as the focus. The year was 1997. Sato had graduated 2 years before in 95 and been working with Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo as an artist. She worked on unit design for the characters in a tactical RPG game called Vandal Hearts, which released in 1996, and left her free to move to a new project. That project would be none other than Silent Hill. Toyama Keiichiro, director of the project, graduated from Tokyo Zokei University in 1994. Sato graduated a year later. In later years, they would work together on Siren and other games, and it's possible the relationship began in school. If Toyama offered her a position on his horror game team, it's likely she would have been eager to accept. She was brought on as an artist involved in multiple aspects, including monster design and demo design. Ito Masahiro was the other primary monster designer for the first Silent Hill, and much like many aspects of the first game, he was given free rein to do as he willed. Toyama, as director, had veto power, and often gave him ideas of what kind of monsters he wanted, but rarely did he tell Ito what to draw. Interviews seem to imply he had the primary control on monster designs, with Sato working alongside him. According to his posts, he designed about half the monsters, with Toyama and Sato finishing the rest. Sato's work involved the nurses, and presumably the doctors, as well as the insect creatures of the game. Her parasitic health workers took heavy influence from her appreciation for Japanese horror. She was imagining The Ring's infamous TV ghost, Sadako, when she designed them and the way they move in the game. Those weren't the only nurses whose designs she had thoughts about. Apparently, she and another team member, Takahashi Isao, had a heated argument about realism in video games, on the subject of the thickness of Lisa Garland's long legs. There were many, many monsters made for the first Silent Hill game. In fact, more than were used in the game itself. There are about half a dozen monsters to be found in the source code which never appear in the game, varying from insectoid creatures, perhaps more of Sato's work, and a chicken-like creature that may have been a boss. An original release date for Silent Hill in one magazine is November of 1998, so perhaps it was a time concern. Perhaps not. Perhaps the concern had to do with a discussion that was raging in video games the world over, and a problem that would lead to Silent Hill editing its own monstrous content down the line. The mid-90s, the United States. A place where far too often popular media of the time is wrapped up in concerns of good and evil. Is rock music making our children satanic? Are slasher films turning people into monsters? Are video games too mature for children? Is there such a thing as a video game for adults? Originating in a legal battle that would lead to the creation of the ESRB, the ratings board that gives video games in the United States their age rating, the discussion of games for adults was huge in the 90s, where the mainstream media's concern was whether games were appropriate for kids. Gaming magazines were discussing how the development of 3D and the broad variety of new games was paving the way for an adults-only genre of video games. 1998 saw an E3 floor with games that had incredibly dark themes: Legacy of Kain, Akuji the Heartless, Metal Gear Solid, all of them with more mature themes and aspects that were meant for adults. Silent Hill was among them, and after its debut at E3, it would be central to the adult games conversation in games media in the West. Reviews and opinion pieces all praised Silent Hill as an adult game. Finally, we have something for the big kids. Finally, there are games that appeal to mature and complex themes, rather than mere entertainment. But there was a problem. Games had, for a long time, been rather tame compared to other media, and for that reason had long been heavily associated with kids. Games magazines were heavily kid and teen focused, and while it wasn't entirely an audience made of the youth, it was certainly a chunk of it. And here was a game that was not meant for that audience. What to do with Silent Hill? After E3, the Konami team was still busy working on the game. Demos, designed by Sato Naoko, Ando Takayuki, and Tsuboyama Musashi, were being put together and sent out to magazines well ahead of the release date. With the game itself still not past the finish line, these demos were important parts of advertising and a major part of getting the game into players' hands, and they were only for adults. Gaming magazines had a choice: put out the demo and risk alienating or angering a part of their audience, or fail to release the demo and undercut their own argument that a genre of mature games should exist. Every magazine handled it differently. The UK PlayStation magazine put out a late notice informing fans they'd removed the Silent Hill demo from their demo disc, citing concerns that young players might get their hands on a copy. Another magazine would put out an altered demo, one with a warning that stated that while the demo was for all ages, Silent Hill would not be. PlayStation Australia released a demo disc that had the intro video from the game, but no playable content. Presumably, these many altered variations of the demo game came from Konami's demo design trio, including Sato. The main Silent Hill team had problems concerning mature themes in games too. How mature was too mature? How far was too far? Many of these issues were centered on the monsters. Take the larval stalker, a ghost-like monster that appears in the school level. These invisible childlike creatures cause the radio to emit static but don't harm the player. The player can't interact with them either, but that wasn't always the case. The original build allowed for the player to attack and kill invisible ghost children, who would never attack the player back. The idea was eventually seen as going too far and was scrapped, and other child-themed monsters would face similar setbacks. In 1997, a terrible tragedy would shake Japan to its core. 2 children murdered by another child in what are now known as the Kobe child murders. It was an awful tragedy that would have consequences for video games and censorship in the media. The ability to portray violence, especially against children, would be tightened from then on, which had consequences for games like Moonlight Syndrome, which involved stories of children attacking one another and had to cut content that was considered too violent. Silent Hill would have similar issues with children in its game. The E3 version of the game included a childlike creature with pale skin and no eyes. At that point, the game had yet to be approved for public release by the CESA, the Computer Entertainment Suppliers Association, established in 1996 in Japan. It organizes many of the gaming events now well known in Japan, and it was involved in approving games for the public retail launch, until the rating agency was turned into a separate branch in 2002. The child monsters from the E3 versions of the game were too childlike for the CESA. The second attempt was also turned down, as was a third. It was only when the creature was made visibly inhuman, with large claws, that it was approved for Japanese release. This was the version that would also be sold in Europe, while the United States received the Gray Child, a version of the original monster. The game finally released in February of 1999 and was a financial and critical success. It was Sato's second game project, and her last time working on the Silent Hill series. But it was only the beginning of her career in games. In Silent Hill, she had designed monsters. In the games to come, she would develop worlds and write stories of her own. After Silent Hill, Sato made the decision to leave Konami. She was hired by Sony Computer Entertainment to work on a game called Yaoko no Mariko. It just so happened she was reunited with an old friend there, Toyama Keiichiro, also assigned to work on Mariko. They reconnected, and late into Mariko's development, Sato heard rumors that Toyama was planning on a horror-themed game set in Japan. It was exactly the kind of game she wanted to work on, one she had imagined herself in the past. Quickly, the two hit it off and began planning their project together. Sato had always seen horror as being best if it was Japanese, because ultimately, as a Japanese person, the only authentic world she could create was a Japanese one. With Silent Hill, she was constantly worried about the authenticity of the game. How realistic could their American town be when none of them were Americans? To have a sense of realism and create immersion, she felt creating a game in her home country would be best, and Toyama agreed. He too wanted to capture the Japanese horror spirit in his next title. They ended up dividing development between them, Toyama handling gameplay, while Sato and her team handled the story. While Toyama had input, she would be the writer. It was the realization of years of reading horror and studying the occult, becoming a horror writer in her own right. She'd always enjoyed researching and investigating strange things. The feeling of trying to uncover the truth delighted her. For this project, she wanted to create something that would take investigation, a story that wouldn't be understood clearly straight away. It would take reading between the lines to fully understand. That project became Siren, the first in a series that Sato and Toyama would spearhead together. It was a series that Sato enjoyed writing, but struggled to play. Testing the title for bugs, she found herself so frustrated at one point she threw her controller to the floor. Her work on the series always began with reading and reading. The works of Fuyumi Ono and Ryoko Yamagishi inspired her, as well as books like Dagon by Fred Chappell, The Door into Summer, and Blair Witch Maniacs, a book about the world of Blair Witch that inspired the archives of the Siren series. She's a self-described reading maniac. For the Siren series, she would end up writing a horror novel of her own, as well as side stories of the Siren universe that would appear on the official website. During the Korean release of the game, someone put forward the idea of creating a novel to tie into the game world, and Sato liked the idea. But when she considered the thought of hiring a professional to do so, she came to the realization no one else could write the book. She was the only one who really knew the story of Siren. In the end, she found the process to be very lonely, enough so at times she felt like running away. It was a completely different process from writing as part of a video game team. She had found herself realizing storytelling in games was her calling. Writing for games is a unique way of telling stories, one she finds great enjoyment from, especially while working with Toyama. It's fun, she says. Toyama thinks of things no one would normally come up with, and tosses ideas at me with no consideration. The hurdles are high, but you get a lot of pleasure out of clearing them. They were close, since they would continue working together for more than 2 decades. Siren would find itself in trouble with censors in a similar manner to Silent Hill, this time for a commercial. The video that was slated to air on television at any and all hours of the day was very quickly determined to be too frightening for television, and was removed almost immediately after it began airing. There was some controversy and some anger at the choice to air the commercial, but ultimately the backlash worked for them. The papers wrote about the removal, and the game received enough attention it began selling out in stores. After 3 Siren games, Toyama and Sato would continue working together on the Gravity Rush series. Sato reprised her role as writer, developing the scenario of both games and the DLC, and in 2017 she gave a presentation on the game for the CEDEC, a convention that occurs yearly in Japan and consists of major game designers giving presentations on their work and research. Her presentation centered on how to write for video games and the struggles and triumphs of her work on Gravity Rush. She's continued to be involved in the Siren series as well, appearing at various celebratory events, getting involved with comic adaptations, and appearing in live streams for the series. The games have only grown more popular with time, especially in Japan, and she says she's grateful for all the love and support, as she had been quite worried in the early years that the team overdid it with the game. She feared people wouldn't notice the things she snuck into the story, and was shocked to find that people did dig deep and investigate the world of Siren, just like she'd wanted. It seems she's still working at Sony Computer Entertainment, and it's possible she and Toyama have, after so long, ceased working together, since Toyama left to create his own game studio. From Silent Hill to Sony, from Siren to Gravity Days, the two have worked on at least 7 different games together, with many landmark titles on their resumes. Whatever else the future holds, these two have undoubtedly left a mark on the industry, and Sato Naoko has helped to create such fascinating worlds that fans are still digging into them years and years later. Many of these issues were centered on the monsters.